You're not getting a single
our
dollar
final
more
offer.
than what I decide you're
You know I
worth.
can't take this.
She
Then you know
slid the
what
folder
happens
across
next.
the marble table without
I'm
even
not
looking
afraid of
up.
you.
Marcus stared at the woman who had just spent 4 weeks of his life without blinking. Ma'am, this isn't about what I think I'm worth. This is the contract you signed. Contracts get renegotiated when people overcharge me. He said nothing at first. His hands, still faintly stained from 3 sleepless nights sealing hairline cracks in the West Wing ceiling, rested flat on the table. He thought of his daughter falling asleep on a folding drop cloth because there was nowhere else for her to wait for him. He said none of it out loud. He simply closed the folder, picked up his worn toolbox, and walked out.
There is still work to do.
3 days later, her head housekeeper packed her own bags too. Then the chef, then the driver, then almost everyone who had ever worked inside that mansion. By the end of the week, one of the wealthiest women in the state was standing alone in a 15-bedroom house she couldn't even find someone to clean. This is how it happened. Marcus Hale had not planned on becoming anyone's inspiration. He had only ever planned on getting through each day without letting his daughter feel the weight he carried alone. Every morning began the same way in their small rented duplex on the edge of town, before the sun, before the world woke up, packing her lunch into the same faded blue lunchbox she refused to replace. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier. Grief had learned to sit quietly in the corner of every room while he worked. He was a restoration carpenter, the kind other contractors called when a job seemed impossible. Few people outside his small circle knew his name, and he preferred it that way. Reputation didn't pay rent. Finished work did. He'd taken this job the same way he took every job since Emma's mother died, by doing the math twice before saying yes. 4 weeks was tight even for a healthy structure. The mansion's West Wing was not healthy, but the number on the contract would cover the heater Emma's room still didn't have, and the deposit for the science camp she'd been talking about since a school field trip to the Aviation and Space Museum downtown. He said yes before he let himself think too long about the risk. Across town, Diane Calloway ran Calloway Holdings, a real estate empire she had inherited from her father and expanded far beyond what he ever imagined. She rarely smiled. She had built her reputation on being the one person in any room who never blinked first, and she believed sentiment was a liability other people simply couldn't afford to indulge. An unusually harsh winter storm had cracked the foundation beneath her mansion's west wing, buckling beams, spreading water damage through walls that had once hosted senators. A gala securing a partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars was scheduled in 4 weeks. Every major restoration firm she called quoted 6 months or refused outright. That was when her project manager, almost reluctantly, mentioned a name: Marcus Hale. Diane's security team asked him twice for identification before letting his old pickup truck past the gate. She barely looked up from her phone. "You have 4 weeks. I don't care how you do it. I care that it's done." There was a portrait of her father in the front hall she passed a dozen times a day and rarely looked at anymore. He had built the company on handshake deals in an era when that still meant something, and he had always said the same thing to her when she was young enough to still be trailing him through job sites. Pay the people who build things for you, and they'll build you an empire. Cheat them, and you'll be standing in it alone. She hadn't thought about that sentence in years. She didn't think about it now either, not consciously. It simply sat somewhere in the back of her mind the entire time Marcus Hale's truck idled at her gate. Marcus studied the damage in silence for nearly 3 hours before speaking. "It can be done, but it has to be done exactly the way I outline it, no shortcuts. And if it isn't finished, then I don't get paid. That's already in the contract you're about to sign." She signed it without another word, though something in the way he'd said it stayed with her longer than she expected. For the next 4 weeks, Marcus practically lived inside that mansion, arriving before the staff turned on the lights, leaving after the gates were already locked for the night. The work itself was brutal in ways the contract never captured, tearing out water-rotted framing by hand because the damage ran deeper than the drawings showed, rerouting electrical conduit that hadn't been touched since the 80s, replacing beams twice the size of anything in his own house just to meet code he'd set for himself, not the one the county required. Emma came with him most afternoons, doing homework in an unused sitting room, occasionally falling asleep on a folded drop cloth by 9 o'clock while she waited. One evening, passing the hallway on her way to a call she didn't want to take, Diane paused at the sitting room door. Through the gap, she saw the girl asleep against a stack of blankets and Marcus kneeling nearby, quietly tightening a loose floorboard so it wouldn't creak and wake her. Diane didn't say anything. She wasn't sure why she stood there as long as she did before walking away. A week later, her assistant mentioned almost in passing that the contractor had turned down a same-day rush job from a hotel chain, twice the money, because he'd already committed his 4 weeks to her house. Diane said nothing at the time, but she found herself thinking about it later that night, the kind of thought she usually didn't allow room for. 10 days in, a section of the upper floor gave way without warning while Marcus was checking a joist connection beneath it, dropping debris and dust through the gap he'd just opened. He threw himself sideways against the nearest support beam rather than let the falling section hit the walkway below, where Emma had been sitting minutes earlier before he'd sent her to the kitchen for a snack. He came up bruised, coughing through the dust, already recalculating the load path in his head before anyone even reached him. He didn't report it to Diane. He simply reinforced the section twice over and kept working. Grace Whitmore, who had run that household for 11 years, began leaving snacks outside the sitting room door without being asked. "You don't have to do that," Marcus told her one night, exhausted, sawdust clinging to his forearms. "I know," Grace said. "I want to." 2 weeks in, Grace found him working past midnight by flashlight, adjusting a beam because the power to that section had been cut for safety. "She's not out here checking what time you leave," Grace said, setting down a cup of coffee. Marcus managed a tired smile. "I'm not doing it for her to notice. I'm doing it so it doesn't fall on somebody's head in a year." The night before the final walkthrough, Diane found herself standing at her office window long after everyone else had gone home, watching his truck's headlights finally pull away down the drive. She didn't examine the feeling. She simply told herself she was tired and went to bed. The independent inspector's report came back exceeding code on every point. Diane read it twice, alone in her office, and said nothing to anyone. The final invoice arrived 3 days before the gala. For Marcus, that payment meant clearing months of overdue bills and finally paying the deposit for the science program his daughter had been begging to attend. Diane rejected it anyway. "This is nearly double what we originally discussed. Because the damage was worse than anyone estimated. You read the same report I did. I read a contractor trying to justify inflated numbers." "Ma'am, every hour on that page is logged. Every material is itemized down to the receipt." Marcus kept his voice level, though his jaw had tightened. "You want me to pull the original scope of work and show you exactly where it changed and why? I want you to understand that I don't get where I am by writing checks just because someone hands me a folder and a sad story. I never told you a sad story." He looked at her for a long moment. "I told you what the work cost." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. For one moment, he almost told her everything. The drop cloths, the skipped dinners, the unpaid deposits sitting in his inbox. Then he closed the folder, picked up his toolbox, and walked out. That evening, Emma placed her small hand over his fingers at their kitchen table. "Daddy, why didn't the lady pay you?" "Sometimes, sweetheart, people don't always do what's right." "But you did everything right. I watched you." "I know you did, baby." His voice cracked slightly. He didn't let her see the rest. 2 days later, a property manager Marcus had worked for before called with a rush repaint job. Decent money, cash on completion. It would have covered the science camp deposit outright. "I'd need you starting tomorrow. Can you do it?" the manager said. Marcus looked at the unpaid invoice still sitting on his kitchen counter, then at Emma doing homework at the table behind him. "I can't start tomorrow. I've still got a dispute to settle on my last job first." "That's your call. Offer's only good through Friday." He hung up and didn't call back that week. It would have been easy money, and he needed it. He also knew that if he let the mansion job go unresolved and walked into someone else's house pretending it hadn't happened, he'd be carrying that unfinished business into every job after it. He'd rather be broke and square than paid and small. Grace overheard the whole conversation through the study door that same afternoon and said nothing to Diane. She only found Marcus's number in the old contractor file and sat with her phone in her hand for a long time before setting it back down. The next morning, she walked into Diane's office. "Pay him by Friday, or I walk." Diane looked up slowly. "Excuse me?"
"You heard me. That man rebuilt this house with his bare hands while his daughter slept on drop cloths in your hallway, not while I'm still working under this roof." Diane let out a short, cold laugh, but it didn't land the way her laughs usually did, and she heard the hollowness in it even as she said it. "You'll be gone by tomorrow if you keep talking like that." "Then I'll be gone tomorrow." She was. Diane told herself it didn't matter. Grace was one person. Monday morning, Antoine was plating breakfast when his phone buzzed with a message from Grace, 3 lines explaining what had happened. He read it twice, set the pan down, and turned off the burner mid-order. "Antoine, table 2 is waiting," the assistant chef said. "Table 2 can wait." He untied his apron, folded it neatly on the counter the way Grace had taught him years ago, and walked out through the service entrance without another word. Diane found out from a text her assistant forwarded her, 3 words long. "He's gone too." Tuesday, she asked her driver, Samuel, to bring the car around for a client meeting. He didn't answer his radio. When she finally reached him by phone, his voice was calm, almost apologetic. "I've driven for this family 12 years, Miss Calloway. I drove Marcus's little girl home myself once when it was raining too hard for her to wait for her father. I can't keep driving for a house that treats people like him this way." He left his keys on the kitchen counter that afternoon and didn't come back. By Wednesday, the events coordinator, brought in specifically for the gala, called to say she wouldn't be staffing an event under these circumstances and hung up before Diane could respond. Diane stood in her office window that Wednesday evening, watching the last car disappear down the driveway, and for the first time in years felt something she didn't have a name for. Not anger, something closer to fear. A board member called that same night. "Diane, I'm hearing your entire staff walked out over an unpaid contractor. The gala is in 5 days. Half our partners are flying in to see that house." This isn't a staffing issue anymore. It's a character issue, and those don't fix themselves with money. The line went dead before she could answer. The next morning, one of the partners scheduled to attend the gala, a soft-spoken investor named Weller, who rarely involved himself in gossip, called her directly instead of going through his assistant. "Diane, I've worked with your family for 15 years, he said. "I'm not calling about the staffing. I'm calling because I heard the man who rebuilt your West Wing walked away without being paid for it, and now I'm wondering what happens to agreements once the ink dries on the deals we're about to sign together." "Weller, I'm not accusing you of anything," he said, cutting her off gently. "I'm telling you what it looks like from the outside, and from the outside it looks like a problem." He didn't cancel, but he didn't confirm either, and the silence on the line after he hung up felt heavier than an outright no. 2 days later, Harold Voss, who had managed the estate for nearly 30 years under her father, asked to see her. He sat across from her, unimpressed by the marble he'd once helped select. "Nobody doubts the contractor's skill," Harold said. "The real issue was never the money. It was character." "I know how it looks, Harold." "Do you?" He leaned forward slightly. "Because from where I sat for 30 years, your father built this house on one rule he never bothered writing down. Pay people what they're owed, and they'll build your empire with their own hands. Cheat them once, and they'll tear it down just as quietly, and you won't even see them do it." "I didn't cheat anyone. I disputed an invoice." "You disputed an invoice that an independent inspector confirmed was accurate from a man who let another job walk away this week rather than leave yours unresolved." Diane went still. "You didn't know that part." She hadn't. If you can refuse to honor an agreement with the one person whose work holds up the roof over your head, what does that tell everyone else about how replaceable they are the moment it's convenient? Diane said nothing. She was already thinking of the creaking floorboard he'd quieted so a sleeping child wouldn't wake. She drove there alone that evening, without an assistant, without a plan. The neighborhood was nothing like her own. Small yards, chain-link fences, a basketball hoop with no net 2 houses down. She found Marcus kneeling in his small front yard, helping Emma tape together a lopsided model airplane, laughing every time the wings collapsed to one side. Emma saw her first. "Are you the lady who didn't pay my daddy?" Marcus turned, straightening slowly, his expression guarded. "Emma, go on inside for a minute, okay?" "It's all right," Diane said quietly, and for the first time in this story, her voice carried no edge at all. "She can stay, if that's okay with you." Marcus studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "I owe you a payment, and an apology I don't know how to make properly." "Why now?" His voice wasn't cold, just tired. "You had the inspector's report on your desk for 3 days before you rejected that invoice. What changed?" "Nothing changed." She looked down at the cardboard wings scattered across the grass. "I saw you fixing a floorboard so it wouldn't wake her. I heard you turn down other work rather than leave mine half-settled. I told myself none of that mattered because it didn't change what the invoice said. It wasn't the company's money I was protecting. It was my pride. And I let it cost me every person who ever trusted me to do right by them." Marcus looked at Emma, still crouched over her cardboard plane, then back at Diane. "She asked me why the lady didn't pay me. I didn't have a real answer for her. I don't expect one conversation to fix that. No, it won't, but it's a start." The next morning, the full invoice plus a substantial bonus hit Marcus's account. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the notification for several minutes. Tears filled his eyes, not because he'd become wealthy, but because fairness had finally arrived without him having to fight for it in silence. That evening, Grace's phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. "I'm not calling to order you back. I'm calling because the house doesn't feel right without you in it, and because you were the only one honest enough to tell me that before I lost everyone." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it." She came back 2 days later anyway. So did Antoine. So did Samuel. Not because they'd been forgiven for anything. None of them had done anything wrong.
but because for the first time they had a reason to believe it wouldn't happen again. Some houses are held up by beams. The strongest ones are held up by people who chose to trust each other in the first place.